The night she sat down on my porch steps, I had already decided she was someone I needed to stay away from. Not because she had done anything wrong, not because she was dangerous in any way I could name or measure, but because I had been in that town for 4 months, and in 4 months, I had successfully built exactly the kind of life I came here to build. Quiet, contained, and largely invisible, and I could feel just from the way she crossed the yard that she was about to make that very difficult. She sat down without asking, pulled her knees up to her chest, looked out at the dark street, and said nothing for almost a full minute. The kind of silence that most people rush to fill. She didn't. Then she turned and looked directly at me. "You don't scare me," she said. I looked at her. I didn't say anything. "I know." She turned back to the street. "I just thought you should hear it." I had no answer for that. So I sat in the old wooden chair with my coffee that had gone cold 40 minutes ago, and she sat on my steps, and the September night went on around us. And that silence, that particular, impossible silence between two people who have stopped pretending they haven't noticed each other, was the beginning of everything I had told myself I was never going to let happen. But let me take you back, because that Tuesday night wasn't where the story started. The story started 7 months earlier, in a parking lot outside Fort Bragg, North Carolina, on a January morning so cold the pavement looked like pale glass. I handed in my paperwork. I shook 3 hands. I had been shaking for 6 years. I walked out into that cold, bright air and got in my truck and sat there for a long time without starting the engine, trying to figure out what a man is supposed to do with himself when the only thing he has been for a decade suddenly isn't what he is anymore. My name is Caleb Marsh. I'm 27 years old. For 6 years before that January morning, I was a Special Forces operator with the 3rd Special Forces Group out of Fort Bragg. I won't go into every detail of what that means except to say that I spent most of my 20s in places that don't appear on the maps people keep on their walls, doing work that required a very particular and very narrow kind of focus. The kind that keeps you sharp in a compound at 3 in the morning. The kind that is not especially useful in a grocery store on a Tuesday, or a dinner conversation, or any of the small and ordinary moments that apparently constitute what most people call a life. I had been away from those moments for long enough that they had started to feel like something that happened to other people, something I observed from a careful distance without ever quite believing I was allowed to step into. I left because I had to. The full reason is longer and more complicated than I'm going to tell you right now, but the short version is this. I had gotten to a place where I didn't trust the man I was becoming. Not with the mission. I was still good at that. Not with the team. They still had my back, and I had theirs. But in the hours between, in the quiet places where there was nothing requiring the narrow focus, I had started to feel like something was being carved out of me. And whatever was filling the space wasn't something I wanted to keep filling it. When you stop trusting yourself in the quiet hours, you become dangerous. Not to enemies, to the people on your side. And I wasn't going to wait until I had proof of that. So I left. I picked Harlan, Montana for no reason that would hold up to scrutiny. I had never been there. I didn't know a single person in the state. I found a rental listing that said quiet street, mountain views, covered front porch, and something about that combination made me stop scrolling and fill out the application before I had time to think it through. I drove 12 hours with everything I owned in the back of the truck and pulled into Harlan on a Wednesday afternoon when the town was so still it looked like someone had painted it and forgotten to add the people. The first few weeks were strange, in a way that was hard to describe to anyone who hadn't come from where I was coming from. Strange not because anything bad happened, but because nothing happened at all. The loudest thing was the wind through the maple trees and the occasional dog. There was a diner on Main Street that opened at 6, and I started going there in the mornings because I needed somewhere to be at 6 that wasn't my kitchen. I sat in the same corner booth every time, my back to the wall, watching the room with the complete and total focus of someone who has been trained to read a space for danger and cannot turn that off in a Montana diner at 6:15 in the morning. The waitress, a A woman named Carol, who had probably been working there since before I was born, clocked it on the third morning. She set my coffee down without a word and then said, very casually, looking at the parking lot outside, "Military?" I said yes. She nodded once. "We get a few," she said. She never mentioned it again, but after that, she always seated me in the corner booth without waiting for me to ask. That was one of the first things Harlan gave me. People who saw what you were without making a production of it. The house was a small white two-story on Birch Street with a porch that ran the full width of the front and a yard that needed work. The neighbors on the left were a retired couple who waved at me once, read the absence of a wave back correctly, and left me alone after that. The neighbors on the right were a man named Gerald Calloway and his daughter. I didn't know her name for the first 3 weeks. I noticed her the way I notice everything. Cataloged, assessed, filed. She was mid-20s. Dark hair she wore in a braid that always looked slightly unfinished, like she had started it while thinking about something else. She drove a beat-up green Subaru with a crack running through the rear left taillight. She left the house every weekday at 7:42 and came back most afternoons around 4:15. On Fridays, she stayed later. On weekends, she worked in the small garden on the east side of their yard, crouched over the soil with a concentration that was entirely too serious for the size of what she was growing. I watched her the way I watched everything else in the neighborhood, not because I was interested, because watching is what I do. 6 years had made it automatic, the way a person taps their foot without deciding to. I observe. I track. I file. I told myself it meant nothing. I told myself she was one data point among many in the general inventory of the street, no different from the crack in the pavement on the corner or the neighbor's dog that barked at 5:30 every evening without fail. I told myself that for about 6 weeks, and each week the telling got a little less convincing. The first time she actually spoke to me was in early June. I was in the driveway at 6 in the morning, replacing the brake pads on my truck. I had been awake since 3:30, which was normal. I had already run 8 miles and done an hour of contract work, which was also normal. Now I was doing something with my hands, because sitting still without a clear purpose creates a very specific kind of noise in my head that I have learned it is better not to listen to. She came out of her house in running shoes and a gray sweatshirt, saw me flat on the concrete under the truck, and stopped. "Do you ever sleep?" she asked. "Sure," I said, without looking up. She waited, as though expecting more. I didn't offer more. I heard her shift her weight on the gravel. "I'm Nora," she said. "Gerald's daughter. We've been neighbors for over a month." "I know," I said. "And you're?" "Caleb," she said my name quietly, testing the sound of it. Then, "You're very talkative, Caleb." I didn't respond to that. I heard her laugh, brief, quiet, completely unbothered, and then her footsteps moved off down the street in the direction of the park. I went back to the brake pads. I told myself I had handled it correctly. Brief, uninvested, pointed nowhere. I had built everything in this town around that principle. Work from home, run early, shop at odd hours, don't give anyone anything to hold on to. I had no idea she had already decided I was a puzzle worth the patience. The coffee started 2 weeks after that. I came outside one morning at 6:15 to find a paper cup from the diner on Main Street sitting on my porch railing. Still warm, no note, no explanation. I stood there looking at it the way you look at something that doesn't fit the pattern, trying to figure out whether it matters. Eventually, I picked it up. Black, no sugar, which is how I drink it. She hadn't asked. She had just paid attention. I didn't say anything to her that day, or the next, when another cup appeared, or the day after that. By the end of the first week, I understood it was her, and the understanding sat in an uncomfortable place, because I was prepared for questions and persistence, and the ordinary social pressure of someone who wants acknowledgement in return. I was not prepared for someone who gave without the architecture of expectation underneath it. That kind of patience doesn't give you anything to push against. It just shows up. On the 8th morning, she crossed the yard while I was still on the porch. She held out the cup. I took it. We stood there in the early light for a moment. "You don't have to do this," I said. "I pass the diner on my way to school," she said. "I go every morning anyway. I'm a second-grade teacher. I can get my own coffee." I know that. Not defensive, not elaborating, not waiting for a thank you, just stating something obvious and leaving the rest of the space alone. I looked at her for the first time without the professional detachment of cataloging. Just looked. The way you look at someone who is actually standing in front of you. And she looked back at me with an expression that was calm and almost entirely unreadable. "Thank you," I said. Rougher than I intended. She nodded once and went back to her yard. I stood on the porch with the cup and felt something warm and complicated that I immediately put a lid on and set aside. This was the pattern for the rest of June. Coffee in the morning, a brief exchange, sometimes just a nod, sometimes a few sentences. She never asked about my past or my work or why I had come to Harlan or any of the questions that are really all the same question underneath. She just showed up, quietly, without ceremony, and went away. And I, despite every intention I had arrived in Montana with, started watching for her. Not the way I watched everything else, just watching. The way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when she was reading in the garden. The way she talked to Gerald through the screen door on summer evenings, laughing at something he said. The way she sometimes sat on their front steps with bare feet, looking at nothing in particular, like she had given herself permission to stop running whatever it was she had been running through. I recognized that look. I had never been able to do it myself, but I recognized it in her. And something about the recognition sat in me with a quiet weight I didn't try too hard to examine. The first time she saw me come undone was a Thursday night in July. I want to tell you I handled it with composure. I didn't. The nightmare was bad in a specific way I won't describe in full. What matters is that I came awake already on my feet, already somewhere that wasn't my bedroom, in my own mind. And I hit the doorframe with my shoulder hard enough that the sound of it was loud in the dark house. I went outside. Summer air hit me, warm, smelling of grass and distance. I ran the inventory. Grass under my feet, dark sky, sound of a car 2 miles east on the highway, the light over Gerald's garage that never turned off. I went through what was real and waited for my heart rate to come down. Nora was sitting on her front steps. She didn't move toward me, just sat there in an old flannel shirt, hands around a mug, looking at me across the dark between our yards, and I could tell from the stillness of her, the complete absence of alarm, the complete absence of the careful performance people give when they don't know what they're looking at, that she had been sitting there before I came out, that she had her own reasons for being awake at that hour. She said, very quietly, "There's still some coffee if you want it." The refusal was automatic and ready, but something about the steadiness of her voice, the way she said it like an ordinary thing in an ordinary night, made me walk across the yard and sit down on the steps beside her instead. She went inside and came back with a second mug. We sat in the dark and didn't talk about what had happened and didn't pretend nothing had either. The sky began to lighten at the eastern edge. The first bird started up in the maple tree across the street, and I was sitting on my neighbor's porch steps at 4 in the morning, feeling, in a way I couldn't have prepared for, like I was somewhere I was allowed to be. Then I thought, that is exactly what I was afraid of. I pulled back after that. Not dramatically, I just made myself less available. I ran later. I worked longer hours. When I saw her, I was polite and brief and turned away quickly. The coffee appeared every morning, and I drank it alone. I told myself this was the right call. She let me do that for 11 days. Those 11 days were not comfortable. I had structured my life around a particular kind of discipline. Up at 3:30, run, work, be useful, stay contained. And for the first 6 months in Harlan, that discipline had held. The problem with having someone crack the seal, even slightly, is that once it is open, Maintaining it becomes work of a different kind. You can feel the difference between solitude you have chosen and solitude that is now a response to something. And the second kind has a quality to it that is harder to be in. I drank my coffee alone every morning and watched the cup that appeared on the railing and felt, with increasing and irritating clarity, that I was punishing both of us for the crime of almost being honest. She did not make it easier. She didn't disappear. She didn't stop the coffee. She walked past my house every morning in her running shoes at 7:42, and if our eyes met, she nodded and kept going, calm and unhurried, like she had decided something and was simply waiting for me to catch up. That steadiness was harder to deflect than anger would have been. Anger would have given me something to navigate. This just required me to sit with the fact that I was the one making things complicated. On the 12th, she knocked on my door. I opened it. She was standing on my porch in the evening light with the expression of someone who has been patient for a long time and has decided they are finished being patient for this particular reason. "I'm not going to disappear," she said. "I didn't ask you to. You've been acting like you're hoping I will." "Nora, I'm not asking you to explain yourself," she said. Her voice was level the whole time. No edge, no heat, just clarity. "I'm not asking you to tell me about the nightmares, or where you came from, or any of it. I'm asking you to stop making me feel like a threat. I brought you coffee. I sat on a porch. That's all I did." The words landed somewhere I wasn't ready for. I stood in the doorway long enough that the silence became its own answer, and then I said the only honest thing I had. "I don't know how to do this. Any of this. I am not built for it the way other people seem to be." "I know that," she said, without pity, just acknowledgement. "I'm not asking you to be built for it yet. I'm asking you to stop walking away every time you almost try." She turned and went back across the yard. I stood in the doorway and felt something shift in me that had been locked in place for 3 years. Not a break, just a slow, reluctant turn on a hinge it had forgotten it had. The following Saturday, she invited me to Gerald's birthday dinner, and I said yes before I could stop myself. Gerald Calloway was 61 years old with white at his temples and the hands of a man who had worked with wood for 40 years. He opened the door and looked at me a moment longer than strictly necessary, the look of someone taking accurate measure, and then shook my hand with the kind of grip that means something. "So you're the one who fixed my daughter's taillight," he said. I glanced at Nora. She was already in the kitchen, not looking at me. I had fixed the taillight 3 weeks earlier. The crack had been getting worse, and one morning, while her car sat in the driveway, I had taken 20 minutes and sorted it out. I hadn't mentioned it to anyone. "Cracked taillight is a safety issue," I said. Gerald looked at me one more moment. "Right," he said. "Come in." Dinner was the 4 of us: Gerald, Nora, a neighbor named Walt who had known Gerald 30 years, and me. The food was good. The conversation had the easy, overlapping rhythm that takes decades to develop, and I sat at the corner of the table and let it move around me, and found, to my genuine surprise, that I didn't have to work at being there. I could just sit. I could eat and listen and say something occasionally and have it received without any of the careful social management I was used to performing. After dinner, Nora and I washed dishes while Gerald and Walt took their coffee to the back porch. The kitchen was warm, smelling of garlic and brown sugar, and she handed me plates, and I dried them, and the quiet in the room had a different texture than the silence I usually moved through. It felt inhabited, lived in. "You fixed my taillight," she said. "It was a safety issue." She handed me another plate, not quite hiding a smile. "You said that to my dad, too." Still true both times. We worked through the rest of the stack in quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask." "When you left the military, was it your choice?" I set a glass down carefully, looked at the dark window above the sink, at the backyard where the 2 men sat in the low light outside. "Yes and no," I said. She waited. "I had a team," I said. The words came out unevenly. like they had been under pressure for a long time and weren't certain about the release. 6 guys I'd worked with for 4 years. Good team, solid. And on one specific mission, I made a call that I still believe was right, tactically correct, given everything I knew in that moment. I stopped. But one of my guys got hurt because of it, badly enough that it ended his career. The glass was cool in my hands. He's okay now, physically. But after, I spent nearly a year running the same 12 seconds in my head, looking for the mistake, and I kept arriving at the same answer every single time. That there wasn't one. That I made the right call, and Marcus still got hurt, and both of those things were simultaneously completely true. I set the glass in the cabinet, and I couldn't figure out how to carry both of them at once. How to go back out and do the job while I was still stuck in those 12 seconds trying to understand them. So I left. The kitchen was very still. Nora set down her dish towel. She didn't look at me with the expression I was used to receiving, that careful, compensating look that people put together when they've heard something unexpected and are managing their reaction in real time. She just said, quiet and certain, "That sounds like the loneliest kind of wait. When you're the only one who refuses to give yourself the verdict you would hand to anyone else in the exact same situation." I turned and looked at her. Something in my chest moved. Not broke. Moved. Like a door that had been sealed long enough you've forgotten it opens, and then someone stands on the other side of it without knocking, just present, just breathing, and you can feel through the wood that they are there, and they are not going anywhere. "Yeah," I said. My voice came out rough at the edges. "That's exactly what it is." She nodded once. Then she picked up the dish towel and handed me a glass to dry, and we finished the dishes in silence. Like she understood that I didn't need a response or an absolution. Just someone to stand next to while the weight settled back into its usual place. I drove home that night, thinking about things I had no practical idea what to do with. One evening in mid-August, Gerald caught me in the driveway. I was checking the oil in my truck, and he walked over with 2 cans of beer and handed me one, which was as clear an indication as any that he wanted to talk. We stood in the driveway in the evening light, and he drank his beer and didn't say anything for long enough that I understood he was a man who took his time. "She doesn't do this," he said eventually. I looked at him. "Do what?" "Stick," he said. "She's careful with people. Has been since her mother died." He turned the can in his hand, not looking at me. "She sees something in you that she thinks is worth the patience. I don't know what it is yet, but she's usually right about people." I didn't know what to say to that. I said, "I'm aware I'm difficult to be around." Gerald looked at me then. The direct look I was starting to recognize as his particular way of making contact. "So am I," he said. "Hasn't stopped anyone worth knowing." He finished his beer, set the can on the hood of my truck, and went back across the yard. I stood in the driveway for a while after that, holding the can he'd given me, thinking about what it meant when a man like that handed you something cold on a warm evening and said his daughter was worth your patience. I thought about it for a long time. August was different. I won't say I transformed. That would dishonor the reality of how slow and uneven the actual work of opening up is, even an inch, even to one person. There were mornings where I woke up completely sealed and had nothing to offer anyone, but I stopped retreating. I stopped measuring the days between our conversations and counting them as a metric of safety. I started being outside in the evenings. I started saying yes to things. The first time we went somewhere together in public was in early August, and I didn't handle it gracefully. We drove into town to pick up some things from the hardware store. She needed fence paint and I had offered, which was already progress. And at some point, we ended up at the counter waiting, and there was a sudden loud crash from the back of the store, metal shelving coming down. I moved before I was aware I was moving. I turned, positioned, assessed, my entire body doing something that had nothing to do with conscious decision-making and everything to do with 6 years of a very particular kind of training. It was over in about 2 seconds. Nothing. A teenager had knocked over a display. I stood there in the hardware store aisle with my heart rate at about twice what it should have been and a customer staring at me from 3 feet away. Nora didn't stare. She looked at me once, quietly, and then turned back to the counter like nothing had happened. We paid for the fence paint and walked out to the truck and got in, and she said nothing about it for a full minute while I looked at the steering wheel and waited for the embarrassment to run its course. Then she said, "Does that happen a lot?" "Sometimes," I said. "It's getting less." She nodded. "Does it help if people pretend not to notice?" I thought about it. "Yes," I said, "and no." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'm going to keep pretending not to notice when it happens in public, but I'm not going to actually not notice. Is that okay?" I looked at her. There was something almost absurdly practical about the way she said it, the way she had assessed the situation and come up with a protocol, like she was solving a problem at school, like this was just something to be worked out, and then worked around, and then not dwelt upon. "Yeah," I said. "That's okay." She nodded. We drove back. I carried the paint to her yard and spent an hour helping her with the fence, because neither of us mentioned stopping, and somewhere in that quiet, useful hour, I thought that this was the most normal I had felt since January. We built a rhythm without consciously deciding to. Saturday mornings, she worked in the garden, and I found things to do in the yard nearby, and we talked across the fence without making a production of it. She told me about her students with a specificity that made them real. She knew each one, carried each one, and it was clear she took them home with her at the end of every day, not as a burden, but as something she had chosen to hold. She told me about her father, about her mother who died when Nora was 17, about coming back to Harlan after college, and understanding, without quite deciding it, that she was going to stay. She said it without a trace of resentment, which told me a great deal about who she was. I gave her things back. Small things first, then edges of larger ones. Ohio, my mother's work as a nurse, my father's early departure, and what it had done to the kind of structure I spent my whole adolescence reaching for. The military, and what it had given me, and what it had cost, and the wide space between those two things that I was still learning to navigate. She listened the way very few people listen, without preparing her next thing while I was still talking, just present. In late August, I drove us out to the reservoir 12 miles east of town that she had mentioned once, weeks earlier. We sat on the tailgate with sandwiches she made and watched the sun go down over the water and talked for almost 2 hours about nothing that mattered. And somewhere in the middle of it, I noticed that I had not thought about anything that wasn't directly in front of me for the longest stretch I could remember. "What do you do now, for work?" she asked. "Security consulting, risk assessment for private companies. I can do it from anywhere." "That makes sense," she said. "You notice everything. The way you track a room when we're somewhere together. The way you always sit with your back to a wall. You know what time it is without looking at a clock." She said it plainly, like an observation she had been holding for a while. I noticed around day 3. "Most people find it unsettling," I said. She looked at me, unhurried. "I find it interesting." We drove home in the dark. At her driveway, she got out and paused and looked back at me across the roof of the truck. "Caleb," she said, just my name, with a pause after it that had weight to it. "Yeah," I said. "I'm glad you moved here," she said, "even if you weren't planning on liking it." She went inside. I sat with the engine off and watched the light come on upstairs in the Calloway house, and had a serious and entirely unwinnable argument with myself, which I lost, and went inside and lay on my bed staring at the ceiling until around midnight, the latest I had slept in years. September came. The air changed, that specific shift when warmth and cold start trading places, and the light drops at an angle that makes everything look like a photograph of itself. I took her to dinner, not officially a date, neither of us used that word, but she wore a dark green dress, and I wore the only collared shirt I owned, and we sat in the back corner of the Italian place on 5th Street and talked for nearly 3 hours. In the second hour, she put her hand on the table and I covered it with mine, without deciding to. She looked down at our hands, then up at me. "You're not going to say anything about this, are you?" she said. "I'm thinking." "About what?" "Whether I'm going to be able to do this without making a mess of it." She turned her hand under mine, so her fingers wrapped around the edge of my hand. "Warm, certain. Caleb," she said. "I already know you're going to make a mess of it sometimes. That's not what I'm asking." "What are you asking?" "Whether you'll stay when it's hard." She said it quietly, without drama. "Just a question, the most important one." I looked at her across the candle. The dark braid slightly undone at the end the way it always was. The steady eyes. This woman, who had never once required me to be anything other than exactly what I was, difficult habits and all. "Staying," I said. "That part I know how to do." Her eyes went soft in a way that moved something in me I hadn't known was still movable. "Okay," she said, "then we'll figure out the rest." We walked home, cold enough to see our breath, wood smoke drifting from somewhere across town, the sky overhead enormous and full of stars, the way you only get at elevation in the fall. She walked close, and our hands found each other somewhere along the second block, and when we reached the point where our yards divided, she stopped. I stopped. She looked up at me. I looked at her. The porch light was burning at the Calloway house, Gerald's quiet habit, his way of saying the door is still open. Come home when you're ready. I put my hand against her face, just my palm against her cheek. She leaned into it, barely, the smallest motion, and that small, certain lean undid 3 years of carefully maintained distance in about 4 seconds. I kissed her, slow and deliberate, the way you do something when you're not entirely certain you're allowed to, but have decided the risk is worth taking anyway. When we stepped back, she kept her eyes closed for just a moment. Then she opened them. "You took your time," she said. "I needed to be sure." "And are you?" I looked at her, the slightly unfinished braid, the steady eyes, the woman who had never asked me to be different from what I was, and felt something I can only describe as solid. Not healed, not finished, not easy, just solid, the way ground feels underfoot after a long time on water. "Yeah," I said, "I'm sure." She went inside. I crossed to my porch and sat in the old wooden chair, and the night went on around me, clear and cold and enormous. And for the first time in years, the quiet didn't have any noise underneath it. Which brings me back to that Tuesday, the one I started with. She came across the gravel in the dark and sat down on my steps and said, "You don't scare me." And I said I didn't say anything, and she said, "I know, I just thought you should hear it." And we sat there in the quiet that had by then become our quiet, hers and mine, the particular silence of two people who have run out of reasons to keep their distance and found something better to put in its place. I still wake up at 3 in the morning. I still check the perimeter. I still sit with my back to every wall and locate the exits before I sit down and know what time it is without looking at a clock. These things are not going away. They are part of the architecture of what I am, built into me over 6 years and 100 decisions made in the dark. And I have made my peace with the fact that I will probably carry them for the rest of my life. But now when I come outside at 3 in the morning, there is a light on next door. And some nights, more nights than either of us would have predicted in the beginning, she is already on the steps. And she looks across at me, and I cross the yard, and we sit in the dark with our coffee and say nothing for a while, and the sky turns slowly toward morning in the east, and the first bird starts up in the maple tree across the street. And that is the only perimeter that has ever made me feel like I was exactly where I was supposed to be.